which dominates the country, which is the Fang ethnicity. I think account for 85% of the population of Equatorial Guinea, not quite sure. And it's a population of maybe about 1.5 million. So it's a small country in terms of population base. But a good deal of that is due to the fact that so many people fled the dictatorship. So there is the underinvestment that we saw in the novel. So there is a great deal of wealth in the country, but it is not being shared, it's not being invested in the betterment of the lives of all citizens. And the best you can say about the current dictator is he's not as bad as the last dictator. It's kind of a low bar. Okay, so what else do I want to say? Ethnicity, government. Yes, and this is one of the reasons why it's actually very hard to get information about Equatorial Guinea, because they have a real clampdown on media. So the only media controlled by the state is allowed to operate. So there's very little journalistic criticism coming out of Equatorial Guinea. There is a repression of political opposition, many of them jailed. So it is a country in which it's very hard to criticize the state. And the author herself obviously grew up in his background. She also criticizes the legacy of colonialism, because she believes that the patriarchal model that dominates Fang society now was not always the way Fang society was structured. So she believes that this was also impacted by Western ideas around the man being the head of the household and the subjugation of women that came with Christian missionaries. Now that's open to debate. We'd have to bring in an anthropologist who knows about Fang history. But again, it's very hard to get data about Equatorial Guinea. And she says this herself in the interviews that I'm going to reference. She makes the point in those interviews that she calls herself an artivist, so activist, artivist. So she uses her literature as activism, but principally on behalf of the LGBTQ+ community within Equatorial Guinea. But she also criticizes colonialism, neo-colonialism, and criticizes patriarchy. So she may not explicitly criticize the dictator as a dictator, but she will criticize the structures of patriarchy and the fact that the country is a male-dominated, male-led country. So what she's advocating for, she tells us, is to create a space for people like herself and the character Marcelo that she creates in La Bastarda, people who are not viewed as normal within this very conservative society. And one of the things that she does talk about repeatedly in these interviews is that, you know, she has traveled outside. Her work has been translated. So it's been translated into French, into English, other languages I'm sure, I haven't checked. But she's been invited to give talks in Germany, France, different countries. So she has a profile outside of the country, which she says can cause problems inside the country, because what that does is it others her. It makes her different and unfamiliar to the majority of Fang culture and Equatorial Guinean culture because of her sexuality and because of her connections with outside, with European white culture. So this word mitangan that we've seen several times in the novel, which refers to the Europeans and the white Europeans, is a term that can also be applied to people who are perceived to have become acculturated within those European cultures. So who have become foreignized in the eyes of their peers in Equatorial Guinea. And Marcelo is one of those characters. Marcelo is viewed with suspicion over and over again because of the time that he spent in the lands of the Mitangan and the fact that he burned his father alive, which of course we know did not happen. So anyone who is associated with a different culture is viewed with suspicion. And one of the things she says is that Equatorial Guinea is not a country that likes self-criticism. So they don't like to be criticized, particularly if they perceive that criticism coming from the lands of the Mitangan. So what she says is her writing is trying to create a space for her community, LGBTQ+, but also to, no, it's not that she explicitly says this, but she talks enough about it, to propose a counter-history, a history that looks at women. So if we think of the grandfather, Osa, for him, the only history that counts is the history of the male founder of the village and the direct descent from that male founder of the village. So for the grandfather, history is something that is created by men. It is not created by women. So the author is trying to address that lack of a female perspective on the history of Equatorial Guinea. What else do I want to say about her now? Oh yes, and about her as well. This short novel, which you've now finished reading, it's got everything in there. It's got gender, sexuality, patriarchy, colonialism, neocolonialism, everything, underdevelopment, everything, it's all in there. It is a critic's delight. I mean, I read it and I thought, this is crying out to come into a classroom, which I sometimes think is perhaps the greatest disservice you can do a book. But at the same time, I actually think that this book is a great springboard for discussions around a lot of different issues. Would it astonish you to discover that the author is an expert in gender studies? She's doing a PhD in gender studies in the University of Salamanca. She's a registered PhD student at the moment. She has a master's in journalism, I think, or something. I can't remember now. But she works in academia. She is somebody who works in academia herself in Equatorial Guinea. So that's where she's based. And she's doing her research distance. And she's doing her research in Salamanca because she can't do a doctorate back in Equatorial Guinea. They don't have the infrastructure for the kind of doctorate that she wants to do in gender studies. So what we have in the book is this innocent perspective of this, 14, 15, 16-year-old girl. Do we decide she is in the end? Is she 16 going on 17? Oh, now I've got a song in my head. You know the song? Yeah. Oh no. Anyway, you don't know the song? Anyone? You did? Yeah, it's from. Yeah, I shouldn't have said it. It's in there now. Okay, I'll have to think of some. I'll have to get another song in there. Okay, so she's created this character who can explore all of these issues that she's really interested in and do it with this naive perspective. So it is this naive perspective of the young person for whom what she sees around her isn't necessarily logical. So culture is something that we learn. It's something that we learn the rules, we assimilate the rules, we either follow them or we don't. But what this naive perspective does is it asks very obvious questions about why should it be so that we do things this way? Why is there not a term for this particular way of being? Why is this deemed to be wrong? So she has deliberately created this particular kind of viewpoint to allow her to ask these questions of her own culture, her own history, her own society. We'll come back to that again, I'm sure, because the other thing I wanted to talk about is just a little bit about eco-criticism. And I was going to print off a handout for you, but I couldn't because I got in today and the painters were in my office. I knew the painters were coming, but I didn't think they were going to be that efficient. So, so basically, for concepts of eco-criticism, have you studied eco-criticism before in any other module, any other program that you're doing?
Slightly.
And that was in Politics, yeah. And what did they say about eco-criticism or ecology or environment?
Oh God, a lot.
A lot, okay.
But we were kind of more focused on like the bioeconomy and kind of eco-criticism in that sense.
Okay.
And like agriculture.
Yes. So you could apply some of that, for instance, to what she said about agriculture failing and the rivers, etc., in Equatorial Guinea. Well, eco-criticism in the literary sense, so from the standpoint of where I do my studies, I'm going back to a book called The Eco-Criticism Reader. The Eco-Criticism Reader was in 1996, and it was one of the first really big editions of essays about literature and the environment. And the editors are Cheryl Glaud-Felty and Harold Frome. But if you just, if you look at the James Hardman Library and the Eco-Criticism Reader, and I'm just basing myself around the ideas from the introduction, because all of the essays within it are about US literature and ecology in the US. So they're not that they're directly, but the introduction still has some really interesting ideas. So the introduction is by Cheryl Glaud-Felty, so Glotfelty, Glaud-Felty. And it's Introduction, Literary Studies in an Age of Environmental Crisis. And I've been reading about, I've been reading environmental criticism for some years now, but hadn't thought to put a course together before because I've been just doing crime. And you know what? I think I'm done with crime. I think this is the way to go. Genuinely, because it's just, I think I'm bored with crime. Don't tell oh no, some people from crime are here. I wasn't bored last semester. I just started doing this and I thought, this is wildly new and interesting, and I'm finally getting to work with some of these ideas I've been reading. But environmental literary studies, we talk about crime fiction being a new genre, and it is. Crime fiction is a new genre created in the 1850s. But environmental studies are even newer. And within the literary field, environmental criticism, literary criticism, dates back to around the mid-1980s. Do you remember the mid-1980s? I do. Were they thrilling? Some really good music. Anyway, so it's a relatively new academic discipline. And she's writing it in 1996 in this introduction that, all ecological criticism, she tells us, and I have this typed up, so I will put it up for you, but all ecological criticism shares the fundamental premise that human culture is connected to the physical world, affecting it and affected by it. Eco-criticism takes as its subject the interconnections between nature and culture, specifically the cultural artifacts of language and literature. So there you go. How does that sound? Straightforward enough. I like this. And she asks a number of questions. So she says, okay, so what is eco-criticism? She's defined that. And she says it is the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. But I love what she goes on to say, because it applies to this book. Everything in this particular quotation applies to this book. And I'm quoting again. Just as feminist criticism examines language and literature from a gender-conscious perspective, does La Bastarda do that? Does La Bastarda examine language and literature from a gender-conscious perspective? It does seem to. All that discussion about, do we have a term for this? Do we exist? And Marxist criticism brings an awareness of modes of production and economic class to its reading of texts. Eco-criticism takes an earth-centered approach to literary studies. Great. There is eco-criticism in this novel. It doesn't mean that the novel can be defined as an eco-critical novel. It can. It can also be defined as a post-colonial novel. It can also be defined as a feminist novel. It can also be defined as an LGBTQ+ novel. It can be defined as an eco-feminist novel. Are definitions any good to us anymore? do you think? Or are we going to call it an eco-feminist, LGBTQ+, what else did we say we wanted to put in there? Post-colonial, Bildungsroman. There we go. Snazzy, isn't it? I could imagine the marketers in the publishing house saying, yes, that's the tagline we're going to run with. Hybridity. Hybridity is when you splice two things together. Hybridity. You can do it with plants. When you do it with literature, it just means you're putting two genres together. And I was just talking to somebody over coffee. She said, oh, this thing on Netflix, it's a time travel murder mystery. Time travel? Murder mystery. Is that a thing now? Or is that an amalgamation of sci-fi and crime fiction? Time travel murder mystery. Have you ever seen a time travel murder mystery? I've actually seen more than one. So I know this is a thing, but I watch a lot more television than you do. And I have watched a lot more television than you do because I'm older than you. So I've had time to do that. So we still have crime fiction, we still have science fiction, we still have fantasy, we still have romance, we still have genres, and we know what they are. But increasingly, we have things that are that draw on multiple genres. And so this novel is one of them. This novel, all of the terms that I've used, they are useful in trying to describe what this novel does, or trying to understand what this novel does. But none of them in itself is going to be adequate for doing that. Because if we called this an LGBTQ+ novel, well then we're ignoring other dimensions of it. We're focusing on one particular aspect. And I don't think that's what she wants us to do. I think she wants us to see all of these things as interlinked. Would you like a definition of ecofeminism? Ecofeminism, Felty tells us, and I'm quoting, is the link between the oppression of women and the domination of nature. So, ecofeminism is where you put together eco-criticism or environmental literature from a feminist perspective. And when you talk about ideas like domination of nature by humanity, how long have we been doing that?
Since the cavemen started farming?
Probably. Since the cavemen started farming, doing all sorts, yeah. Since we started managing the environment, since we started agriculture, since we started cultivating crops, since we started putting them together, growing different strains, since we started saying we are the kings of nature and everything else that is here to serve us. So it's that idea of domination, the idea of domination. And eco-feminist arguments start from a point where they say the domination of women, the domination of children as well, the domination of marginal groups, even ideas of racism, any idea that a particular group is better than another, that they must be oppressed, that it is this oppression, this sense that you have a right to live this way by oppressing others, is linked to the oppression of nature. And this seems a little bit, what's the word for it, utopian. Anyone got any criticisms of eco-feminist definitions? Do you think it's fair for feminist critics to say women have been subjugated and oppressed throughout history? I think it's fair to say that. I mean, because if you're looking for evidence, all you have to do is read history. So we know that women were oppressed, that they didn't have the same legal rights, often don't in other societies, even today. So we know that. We know there is an historical context for it. Are we morally better than men then? We're not. No? No, we're not. Oh no. Yeah, so one of the things that I always have a little bit of a caveat is, I think that if we had the structures that we have today and we put women in charge, because there's this idea, if you put women in charge, everything would be better. No, everything would be a lot the same. Some things would be different, but the structures would be largely unchanged, because the structures are the problem. The structures are the issue. You're just changing the people within the structure. So I suppose that's one of the points of ecofeminism, though. It's saying that these structures are the fruit of this long history of oppression and exploitation, and the idea that some people will be dominant over others and dominant over nature. What does the Bible say about this? I like to ask the Bible every now and again what it thinks about things, but only because, you know, the Bible dominates the Western imagination and Western culture, and it's really good for pub quizzes. It is still really good for pub quizzes. It must be. Do you remember back in the Bible, the Christian Bible? It says at one point, so that they get chucked out of Eden. So Adam and Eve get chucked out of Eden. It's very unfair. And Eden is gorgeous. It's lovely, and you know, you don't have to work in Eden. Everything's there. God has supplied everything for you, and they live in a state of innocence, and they enjoy everything, and they just reach over and, hey, there's your fruit on a tree or whatever, and then they fall from grace and they're chucked out of Eden. Eden is one of these imaginary natural places where nature is all bountiful. Nature is benevolent. Nature is beautiful. It is an imaginary idea that is created by humanity across cultures. So time and time again across cultures, there will be this idealized idea of some kind of utopia that we used to belong to, and then we got chucked out for whatever reason. And then God said to them, when he created Adam, he basically said, you're in charge. All of those animals, you see all of those animals I've made, you're in charge of them. All of them, you're in charge. And Adam said, great, I'm in charge, wonderful. So one of the criticisms of Western culture and the biblical ideas that have had such an impact on the development of Western cultural ideas is that the Bible itself, this foundational text of Christianity, has within it this idea of humanity somehow being placed in a position over all of the rest of nature, rather than being an integral part of it. So this is the idea that eco-criticism is trying to push, that feminist and ecofeminism is trying to push, that humanity, all of us, we should be rethinking our place in nature as something more holistic, something where we're not constantly trying to dominate it, but we're trying to live less harmfully within it. How does that sound? Great, great. Can I level with you? Do you know where a lot of my mental energy has gone this last week? I'm trying to pick a new car. And I'm here talking about environmentalism and my place within the wider context. Yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy. Anyone else drive a car? Anyone else have a car? No? Do you like your car?
Yeah, it's a great big car.
I'm not going to ask what kind of car you have, because then I'm just going to go back down the. It's terrible. It's terrible. Picking a car is terrible.
I'm 22. I can't afford a big nice car. It's only a wee tiny thing.
Well, that's I'm driving a Ford Focus from 2011 at the moment, and
Very nice.
they're nice cars, but it's starting to growl. I'm just not sure. I wouldn't sell it to any of you. I wouldn't do that. Anyway, so this idea of how we're supposed to live more in harmony with nature, what does that even mean? And how far back would we have to go to a point where we did that? Where we were, no, I'm going back to your idea of the caveman. Sorry, not particularly. I'm going back to the idea of the caveman. So even, there's something utopian about this project as well, of trying to think, okay, well, how can we have a different relationship with nature? And the more you read about it, again, it gets head-wrecking. Not as bad as trying to pick a car. It really isn't. You can throw any number of ideas at me and I'll think, that's intriguing, and I'll think about them, but they won't. This car, no, I don't know. I think I might just take my Ford to the garage and say, look, keep it on the road for another year. This is wrecking my head, even thinking about this. So was there ever a time when we as a species lived at one with nature? And if so, when was that? And have we any memory of it? And are there people alive today who live that way? Are there people alive today who live that way?
Yeah, I think
There are some. You've got the inside track on this. Okay, is this where your bio?
so. No,
No.
not really. Mainly it was focused on Irish, but we did like a lot of literature. It was the actual module was care, power, and information. So it was looking at literally like texts on bioeconomy and ecological things through the lens of care, power, and information. But a critique of that was looking at it through eco-criticism.
Okay. You've lost part of your audience here. Can you unpack what those terms mean for the others?
Well, like we'll say like care, power, and information. Obviously, like three separate things. So if you're looking at like we'll say agriculture in the Irish bioeconomy, like looking at it through care in like a perspective of I don't know, like being more economically or like eco-friendly and that kind of thing. Looking at it through working with people, animals, kind of taking that side. Then obviously power dynamics, self-explanatory, I think, and then information as well, like media, literary texts, different things like that. And then eco-criticism is obviously there's like different ways of looking at that, interpreting it, I guess.
One of the points Glotfelty makes in this introduction is that, or rather, I think Harold Frum in the preface, is that when this book came out, there was virtually no massive footprint of eco-criticism. There were people who were writing eco-criticism, but they were all doing it in separate ways. They didn't have this kind of conceptual framework to bring them all together. So the term was coined to allow all of these people working in these different areas to think, hey, this is a place where we can learn that what exists within this field, so we at least know what else we could be reading. And that was the mid-1990s. So where are we now? We're about 30 years, going for 30 years in. And I must admit, I had a bit of a moment when I read this. She was talking then very passionately in 1996 about the environmental crisis facing humanity. That was 30 years ago. Where are we now? Anyone here worried about environmental crisis? Yeah, I'm worried about the environmental crisis. Yep. So, do you think we're going to become more environmentally conscious? Have we done so already?
We're making movements to be more environmentally conscious, like electric cars and like even things like reusable cups that we're trying new things to try and help. Like during COVID, the ozone layer healed itself for a while, and then we got back to work, and then it damaged it. We damaged it, not it damaged itself. We
Yes.
damaged it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we are taking steps. One of the things the eco-critics ask are, why are we doing that? So are we doing that because we want to be more in tune with the environment? Or are we doing that because we think, if we don't do this, we're going to die? That sounded very stark, didn't it? But is that part of the motivation? We will not survive as a species if we don't do this. I don't mean like we, obviously we are at some point, but hopefully that'll be very long into the future. They've been promising to find the cure for aging for as long as I've been around, and I'm running out of patience. I'm not sure it's going to happen in my lifetime. But they've been promising to do that since the 1880s, since the 1980s, and they're still promising. Yes, we're so close. We're so close to understanding the tiny biological mechanism that tells our bodies to age. We could switch it off, and then we'd never age. Wouldn't that be lovely?
Imagine the environmental disaster if they did.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is that, isn't there? Yeah.
Would you still be losing your brain cells as you get older?
I don't know.
That'd be good.
It would be a bit of a problem. I could get a brain transplant, like poor things. Anyway, have you seen that film already? No, okay. Anyway, I'm going off at various tangents, but the points are, if you go back to the Fang village, they are not living massively out of step with nature. They don't have much. They don't have much by way of material possessions. They go out and they hunt in the forest, and they fish in the river, and they clear a bit of land and they farm it. But they clear the land as they need it, and then the forest is all around them. So they do represent a kind of culture which is not massively out of step. They're still dominating their environment. They're still in control of the environment that they've cleared, but they're not making a massive impact on that environment. They are not personally overfishing. They are not personally overhunting, because they're only meeting their own small needs within their area. What does cause big ecological problems in the novel?
The outside companies coming in and like overfishing and over harvesting things.
The outside companies, the way they do things, they overfish. So the Fang live there, they want to live there, they want to keep living there, they want to be able to sustain their lifestyle there. They wouldn't even use those terms. It's just natural, that's how it works. But what they have is sustainable. And what the Europeans have when they come in with their big companies is unsustainable. So overfishing, because they're in it for profit, they're not in it for subsistence, it's not for survival. And they cut down the forests, and they cut down the forest for profit. They're not clearing a bit of land to do some agriculture and build a house. No, they're cutting it down and they're selling it. So it's this, that's what's doing the huge harm. And that's what's doing the huge harm within the novel. And that's part of the eco-criticism within the novel. So she's critical of Fang tradition. She's critical of the patriarchy. She's critical of the lack of education. She's critical of the lack of infrastructure. But it's not that she's massively critical of their lifestyle per se. It's more the culture. So it's the division of labor. It's the division of roles within society. It is the division between men and women and what's attributed to both within the culture. Now, what else did I want to say? Feminist criticism. Gottfeldt tells us. Feminist criticism, and I quote, drawing on a wide range of theories to raise fundamental questions about the symbolic construction of gender and sexuality, the symbolic construction. Now, it's not saying that sexuality doesn't exist, but it's talking about how within culture these things are written about. That's what she means by the symbolic construction of gender and sexuality within literary discourse. So if we just take that part of the sentence, then she's done a lot of work on gender and sexuality within this novel. She's done a lot of integration of those ideas into the plot, into the narrative, into what happens. So gender, the roles of women within Fang culture, Fang society, the rivalry between the two women, the two wives, the fact that women never make common cause. They never make common cause to stand up to the patriarchy. Women themselves perpetuate these patriarchal norms. They become, because they have assimilated them, because they believe in them so strongly themselves, they become, again, guardians of the established order. So this is one of the criticisms of how patriarchy operates and how women often operate within patriarchy. So what she's doing is she's looking at this critically, at the silences, the enforced silences, the grandmother herself, where she loses her voice, she falls silent because no one's listening to her, there's no space for her to speak. Even La Casa de la Palabra, the house of the word, and the word is law, is a male domain, because within Fang culture, the ruler of a village is the male descendant of the founder of the village. And women don't get to make big decisions, they don't get to be rulers, as we said. So this is the symbolic construction of gender and sexuality. And also within the symbolic construction of sexuality is the idea of what kinds of sexuality even exist. So, heterosexuality, homosexuality, male, they have a term for. Female, they don't have a term for. So they have the hombre mujer, but then they have to invent the mujer hombre. But even using those terms is to fall back on binary categories to try and establish something that isn't within the binary categories. And coming back to the broader quotation that I'm drawing from, as she continues, she says, Analogous work in eco-criticism includes examining the symbolic construction of species. How has literary discourse defined the human? Such a critique questions the dualisms prevalent in Western thought. Dualisms that separate meaning from matter, sever mind from body, divide men from women, and wrench humanity from nature. So the dualisms she's talking about are these binary ideas, these binary opposites. So men are from Mars, women are from Venus. That was a book some time back. Why Men Don't Listen and Women Can't Read Maps was another of those very helpful books from way back. I don't know if you're familiar with these books. They've actually done studies on this. Why are women less successful in reading maps? And the data seems to support that they are less successful in reading maps. And do you know what they've concluded? It's because they do it less. They do it less, therefore they're not as good at it. Right? The more you do something, the better you get. Sudoku. I do Sudoku. Do you think I was good at it at the start? No. Pretty good now. Master level now. I go online and they offer me something, 67% of people complete this. That's not hard enough for me. Bring it down to the 40s, or it'll be no challenge at all. Could I do that at the start? I've learned how to do it. I learned how to drive. What else did I learn? I learned how to speak French. I learned how to speak Spanish. The more you do it, the better you are at it. And women tend to read maps less than men, or have traditionally done so. And this is one of the reasons that they're not so good at it. Wow, that's just, and they did a study to prove that. It's amazing. Are you stunned at this insight into if you do something less, you're probably not as good at it? Wow. Anyway, my neighbour, I'm sure, at home is better at driving a tractor than I am. I'm sure he is. I've driven a tractor once. And he does it every day. So there you go. I don't think I'm gender. I don't think there's anything in my gender that makes me less able to drive a tractor. What do you think? Picture me in a tractor right now. I only drove one of the Massey Fergusons, not the big cabby things they have now. So these dualisms, this is something that we talk about a lot in cultural studies, dualisms. Because again, this is very much part of the Western philosophical tradition, Western ideas, that men and women are fundamentally different, intrinsically different. And we still get these arguments repeated time and again. Men and women, fundamentally different, good and bad, day and night, black and white, dualisms, opposites, contraries. So this is what she's talking about, this binary way of thinking, a binary way of thinking. If you're not this, then you are this. And that's what she's pushing back against, in all senses. Because if you have a particular concept of what it is to be a man in a given society, and we see what it is in this society, well then that limits the space that men have and the freedom that men have to be something different. They too are straitjacketed into those expectations. So part of what feminism wants to do is break down that way of thinking, to have more freedom for people to be who they are, whatever that is. What else do I want to say about these binaries? Oh yes, mind and body. This is called the Cartesian split. I don't know if you've heard about the Cartesian split. Oh damn it! No, I can't remember the name of the philosopher. Descartes. Yes, Descartes. French philosopher Descartes. D-E-S-C-A-R-T-E-S. I think. Descartes. He came up with this idea of I think, therefore I am. So most of who I am is here. It is the mind. But he's not the first person to come up with this. It's this idea that somehow our spirit, our mind, is different to our body. The idea that the body is some kind of mechanical means by which we get around, but that we are basically two very separate things, mind and body. Whereas, in fact, modern science is demonstrating more and more and more how interlinked both of these things are. But this duality of thinking, okay, our mind is somehow superior to the body, the matter, this physical frame, is just a nuisance, a thing we have to put up with. Because if you go back to Christian ideas, all kinds of religious ideas, well then the real world, the real place that we will go to in due course is where? Heaven, for instance. And what part of us is going to heaven? Our soul. And what relationship does our soul have with our body?
Like right now,
Right now they're one. But then what happens when
they break up.
they break up and the soul goes floating off to heaven? That's what I mean by the idea of the dualism. That's what they're coming up when they're talking about this split between matter and mind, the body and the idea of the soul, the spirit, the consciousness, even if you just call it consciousness, that somehow consciousness may survive the end of the body, etc. So that's basically what this split is, rather than trying to think about things differently. I have asked some of our colleagues in philosophy, I said, all of those really clever men, I meant men, across all of the centuries of philosophical thought, thousands of years of philosophical thought, they thought about freedom, they thought about what it is to be human, they thought about science, they thought about the origins of the universe, they thought about everything. I said, why did it never occur to any of them that men and women were both equally human? And he said, I don't know. And that's one of the legacies we come from. In Western tradition, we come from that legacy of Greece and Rome, the subjugation of women in both of those places, and the philosophical ideas that somehow women were lesser souls, were lesser humans to men. And that informed Christian thought in due course, including the hierarchies within the Christian church, which were not open to women, and in some Christian religions still aren't. How do you feel about joining an organisation where you can't get to be president someday? I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that. Kieran O'Hogarty, watch yourself. So let me see. So these are the things that she's working with. And I know that this is a lot, it's going to sound a bit vague and woolly, but those are just the ideas I'd like you to think about over the weekend, or not, because it's a bank holiday weekend, so feel free not to think about anything at all. And think now, how do you see them applying to the novel? I did want to say one thing, I got sidetracked by myself. The issue of the construction, the symbolic imagination of sexuality. What we discussed in the previous class, this alienation of the women from their own bodies, from their own sexual experience. I don't know, they never really talked about pleasure, they never talked about that aspect of sexuality in the novel. But the idea of ownership, that women, like the grandmother, have internalized this idea that they don't even have ownership over the most intimate parts of their own body. That is something that is only for access and pleasure, presumably for the meal. This again is the idea of how sexuality is constructed, because that's within a heterosexual relationship. But that idea of heterosexuality is not something that would necessarily cross all cultures either. And when you think of it in those terms, you can see what she means when she says the cultural construction of sexuality, among other things. Anyway, there you go, weighty stuff for a Friday, a rainy Friday. Had you your heart set on studying some of the sci-fi short stories that I mentioned within the module description? No? So if we stuck to, because I actually thought if I include them now, which I can, it leaves less time to explore the broader ideas. I like discussing the broader ideas, plus you all have to do presentations at some point, and I'll give you more information about that next week, but we'll worry about that before reading week, not before the bank holiday weekend. It's a bank holiday weekend. Enjoy your bank holiday.